It's interesting how, in a desperate attempt to downplay one of the biggest Nintendo IPs there is, Pokemon, the Pretendos have put themselves in a position where they have to acknowledge the reality that Palworld, at its peak, was far more popular than Elden Ring Shadows of the Erdtree. What does that mean? It means that a lot of people were not interested in playing Shadows of the Erdtree, that Elden Ring isn't as popular as Pokemon, that FromSlop long term will not be able to compete with Nintendo properties in general, and it just kind of demonstrates what I've been saying about FromSlop in general, is that these games are not capable of maintaining these kind of numbers and this kind of attention and praise, right? Eventually, people are going to get bored of the FromSlop formula. And what I've been seeing, and this is something I've taken notice of when it comes to like the newer Doom games as well, is that the people who are blindly worshiping FromSlop, the people who like love Elden Ring, they're not fans of Dark Souls, right? This is, in a lot of cases, their first Dark Souls, like FromSlop game. With the newer Doom games, like these people started with 2016, and that's led to them to having this misconception that like, ooh, the entire universe revolves around these releases. But in reality, like, older fans are looking at these games and they're just like, oh, these aren't as good as the old ones. Again, like this is happening with Elden Ring too, to an certain extent, because I had a realization recently that like Elden Ring can't possibly be harder than the original Dark Souls, right? They casualized it to a certain extent, considering the new mechanics and like the open world. Like Elden Ring, like stripped away everything that made Dark Souls like what it was, and people are not taking notice of that because a lot of the most hardcore Dark Souls fans, Elden Ring fans, have never played Dark Souls, right? It is a real phenomenon right now where we keep seeing these new, young, ignorant people coming into the sphere trying to say that like, oh, Palworld, it's outstripping Pokemon. It's it's the biggest game there is. Blah blah blah. Like, oh, it's Firework. Okay, like it's the biggest game there is, right? They really thought for like a week. Actually, it was 2 weeks. That like Power World was going to be bigger than Pokemon. That it was going to have all this merch. That they were going to be untouched by Nintendo. That it was going to be this constant big thing going forward, like the Pokemon competitor. What happened? It fell off after a couple of weeks. After people realized how stale, derivative, boring, and uninspired it was. But at its absolute peak, it far surpassed Shadows of the Erdtree, which to me indicates like where the gaming industry is headed. Like considering games like Pizza Tower and Elden Ring, right? Everything that comes out is going to be a knockoff of some Nintendo game, right? The FromSlot formula, of course, is derived from The Legend of Zelda, specifically Zelda 2, and Power World is a ripoff of Pokemon, right? They straight up ripped models from it, right? So right now there's this like kind of weird like attempt at trying to downplay this and try to say like, well, actually, FromSlop is way better than Zelda. Pokemon doesn't own its models. Like it's like there's this weird damage control to try to prop up these brands and these ideas, right? How long did I tell people that like Hi-Fi Rush clearly bombed, but like Tango Gameworks doesn't want to admit it for some reason. Shinji Mikami left the company immediately after it came out, right? Uh, the the success of that game was clearly not real, right? I've said the same thing about Cyberpunk 2077. Uh, and what happened after that? Like a year after that, Tango Gameworks laid a bunch of people off. No, they shut down the entire studio. And Microsoft is on the warpath, like shutting down all these studios that they acquired because they're simply not pulling in money, right? Microsoft's like last gamble at remaining relevant, with the Game Pass service has failed, right? All those games they tried to prop up and make relevant, stuff like Titanfall, uh, like all of it completely fell by the wayside and is completely irrelevant, right? Psychonauts 2 was one of the biggest disappointments of the year it came out, right? Like when you really look at like what's actually happening with this software, you're seeing that like it takes too long to be produced, it doesn't stay relevant for very long, and people don't genuinely enjoy it unless they think they can weaponize it against Nintendo in some way, right? That is the big thing I've been noticing about like the Pretendos as a whole is that like they don't enjoy games. Like for them, it's just playing certain games or like playing on certain products is just a status symbol. Right, nobody plays on Steam Deck. Nobody prefers Steam Deck to a PC, right? But because like the steampunks need to rally against Nintendo consoles, the Switch in particular, they have to do this thing where they have to pretend that Steam Deck is potentially going to eclipse Nintendo Switch, right? They have to pretend that mobile is valuable, right? They have to pretend that like Nintendo sales are going down and that like the next consoles are going to do well and that like the games are getting lazier and that the games are too expensive, right? They throw everything at the wall trying to destroy Nintendo and yet like nothing works. So but like they keep screaming it anyway in hopes that like they can recapture some of the Wii U era magic, which simply isn't going to happen in this day and age with now that everybody uses social media and everybody watches Nintendo Directs and everybody's like engaged with their own specific communities. Like in a lot of ways, I don't think the Pretendo culture has completely collapsed, right? I don't think it's going to be around 10 years from now. And the reason for that is purely because like the Sony's control over the gaming journalism industry has collapsed, like in part because of woke culture, but in part because of just like Nintendo's just excellent business decisions, how they've handled all of their hardware releases, like how they've shifted away from like traditional gaming news outlets and invented the direct format. Like it's difficult to downplay games like Mario and Luigi, like brothership in this day and age. Like 10 years ago, if they released something like that, like the game journals would have just ignored it, right? Like I saw that happen. Like I always tell the story of like the little girl, like the 10-year-old girl who wrote into like Game Informer asking like, why don't you cover Nintendo games? And they responded, they snarked to a 10-year-old girl, oh, they don't have anything coming out. Meanwhile, like, you have all these 3DS games and all the big Wii U games coming out. Like, again, it was like it looks very deliberate for someone who's like aware of what Nintendo's releasing and what they're doing, just how little that uh those gaming journalism outlets covers or talks about those releases. And anybody who's like plugged into it like realize like who anybody who like takes notice of that eventually starts seeking out like alternative means of information. And that's what spawned that. It's that kind of culture that spawned the Nintendo Direct. Nintendo straight up bypassed these gaming journalism outlets and suddenly like these like the gaming journalism journalism industry, which is still very much in place, suddenly has no power, right? They can't downplay Mario and Luigi like they did 10 years ago, right? Like they can't downplay Echoes of Wisdom, right? They can't really drum up controversy at all, right? Like all they're doing is just flailing around, like relying on like their established consumer base, but they're not expanding. They're not doing anything. And I do think that's the big thing to like take notice of, like in this generation in particular, is that like it feels like the Pretendo audience is like in decline, not like increasing, right? More people are becoming fans of Nintendo software and their game, like Nintendo hardware and its games, right? People are beginning to realize that Nintendo is better, and the people who are so vehemently like against them are people who have been indoctrinated since birth that like Nintendo is the enemy and that they're evil, right? How many times have I seen people like spurred out about like, ooh, Nintendo developers are good, but like corporate is evil. What are they doing? Like, what are they doing? Like, oh, their games are too expensive. Like, they're reasonably priced. Like, no, it's like they take down YouTube content. No, they don't. Like they throw all this weird like insane narratives towards Nintendo that don't make a lot of sense. That if you look into them even a little bit, you would realize very quickly aren't actually true at all, right? But they're still going to push them. They're still going to argue for them because when you take that away from them, when you realize that like Nintendo corporate is actually based, that they're actually like the best run business in the industry, right? When you understand like how they treat the developers and like how they actually do have lower budget games, they actually have like reasonable dev times. Like when you really take into account just how well put together everything actually is, like you begin to realize Nintendo is the best company in the industry, and it's not even really a competition. And And now, like, we're in this weird position where people are willing to like go to extreme lengths to try and downplay Nintendo, right? You know, they will worship something like Elden Ring and seriously try to tell you that it looks better than Zelda, like better than Zelda, right? They will worship Palworld and try to tell you that it will be competitive with Pokemon, the biggest brand on the planet, right? They're gonna seriously try and come out and say that like uh, Nintendo is going to like fall off somehow, even though there's no viable competitors left. You know, mobile can't do it, PC can't do it, Xbox and PlayStation can't do it. What exactly is going to overthrow Nintendo in the next 20 years? Right? There is nothing in a good position to do that, and Pretendos are simply not capable of dealing with what is going to come.